For the Young at Heart is sponsored by Duville Life and Wellness Community, a commitment to care, a legacy of compassion. This is Duville.
Hello, welcome to Father Young at Heart. I'm Lucille Jerome. On today's program, we're going to be taking a look at the strike in Lawrence, 1912, and it's often called the Bread and Roses strike. My guest today is Dr. Robert Ferrant. He is a history professor at UMass Lowell, and he's very instrumental in knowing everything about, everything just about the history of the event and what's gone on. Thank you so much for coming.
My pleasure.
Thank you. I understand you also chaired the 100th year anniversary.
Yes, in 2012 it was the 100th anniversary of the strike, and through the Lawrence History Center and the Lawrence Heritage State Park, other organizations in the city, it was decided to do a big centennial remembrance of the strike, the issues around the strike, create an exhibit that people in the city could see, that school kids could come and visit, and try to recreate, in a sense, what the strike was about. And so we did events over an entire year of 2012, starting on January 11th, the first day of the strike. We actually had a walkout of a mill building, the very mill building where the strike started. We reenacted a walkout of workers and marched on City Hall, just like the workers did. And so we had a lot of events like that over the course of the year that could involve the community, especially involve young people in Lawrence who don't necessarily know the history of the city or the strike.
Right. What was the genesis of the strike? What prompted that strike? It wasn't the first strike, but what prompted this particular strike?
There had been other strikes, other attempts at organizing workers in Lawrence. Lawrence was basically, in the history books of the time and commentators at the time, referred to Lawrence as a gigantic factory. The town was mills and worker housing and workers and little else. And so there had been efforts to try to organize workers in the mills. The existing labor unions in America, particularly the American Federation of Labor, were not really interested in organizing immigrant workers, women workers, semi-skilled, unskilled workers. They were very much oriented to organizing craft workers, highly skilled workers, pipe fitters, electricians, things like that. And so the vast majority of Lawrence textile mill workers, woolen mill workers, were not in any unions, and slowly but surely they began to form their own sort of organization. Lawrence had lots of immigrant groups, over 30 different nationalities in the city, and a lot of those immigrant workers brought their own working class politics with them from whatever country they came from, be it Italy or Germany or Holland or, or Greece, Turkey, wherever it was. And so there was a ferment, if you will, in the city, right? People understood what was happening. So that's part of the background. The other thing was Lawrence was a particularly harsh city to live in. And by that I mean Lawrence had one of the highest infant mortality rates in the United States. Lawrence had one of the highest death rates for children under the age of 5. And it had one of the lowest life expectancies for working people. So everybody in the city that worked for a living in the mills knew somebody who died young, who had a baby that died, who they knew somebody in maybe their own extended family who had gotten sick or injured at work. So this is the existence that people have. It's extraordinarily difficult. So that's the backdrop. The trigger is that in the Massachusetts legislature in 1910 passes a law that says that on January 1, 1912, the legal work week is going to go from 56 hours to 54.
Yeah.
And the workers are on such a short leash in the sense of having money to pay rent, buy food, do anything else. They're concerned that they might lose even those 2 hours of pay, which is like 3 or 4 loaves of bread,
Sure.
but nonetheless significant if you were a working person in Lawrence at the time. And so this had happened prior, where it went from 58 to 56. And when it went from 58 to 56, the mill owners didn't cut workers' wages. They paid them as though they were still working 56
Right,
hours.
right.
So when it was announced that it would go 54 to 52, a delegation of workers went to William Wood, who was the main proprietor of many of the mills in Lawrence, and wanted to know what's going to happen. And he wouldn't tell them. And so by inference, they figured out, well, if he's not telling us, it's not good news.
Right.
And so for the last half of 1911, starting in the summer of 1911, workers are organizing, somewhat out of sight of the mill owners, and they're sort of creating the scenario. If we get paid the first time in January of 1912, and our wages are cut, we're going to walk out.
So they were doing this spontaneously on their own. There were no outside union workers at that particular time helping them?
There had been infrequently people trying to organize. There had been in the city for a while workers who belonged to the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW.
Yep, yep.
The IWW was in fact the opposite in many ways of the AFL. The IWW would organize immigrant workers, women workers, African American workers, unskilled workers.
Okay.
And so in Lawrence there were small language organizations of the IWW. There was a small Polish group, there was a small Lithuanian group, a small Italian group, Flemish group, but they were tiny. But nonetheless, they were influential. But there were no like full-time organizers. This is very much grassroots.
Right.
And so building up to January 11 and January 12, the first 2 days of the new year when people will get paid, everybody sort of has made this pledge to each other that this is what happens. But of course, nobody knows, right? Everybody goes to bed January 10th, wakes up January 11th, and the first group of workers that go to work in the Everett Mill, they're the first workers to get paid. They're largely Polish and they're largely women. When they get paid, their pay is short 2 hours. And so they, in fact, do walk out. Now, the history could be totally different had they not, but they did. They kept the pledge, right, that everybody had made to each other. They walk out and they start parading around. In the mill district in Lawrence, the mills are all pretty close together. And so it's just a few short blocks on either side of the canal, and you can pretty much go to most of the mills, woolen mills in the city. Most of the buildings are still standing today. If anybody wants to go and kind of look at what it was like, you can almost imagine it. So they start marching down Canal Street, yelling into the windows of all the other mills, short pay, short pay. And the next day, on January 12th, when the majority of workers get paid, they too are short. This is a Friday. And everybody walks out. Several thousand workers march out of the mills, go to City Hall, have a gigantic rally, and now the strike is on.
Started with the women.
Started with the women.
The women.
Absolutely.
They started this whole thing.
Absolutely started with the women.
Okay, so then it started then. How long did it last? I was trying to catch up on some of it too, and there were some dangerous things that were happening. Okay, and there might have been a death, I think, or two at least. There were 2 deaths.
Yep.
Okay, and so these disparate groups are now working together.
Yes.
And the media starts coming involved, and then it mushrooms from there. So how did it then become something to be known as the Bread and Roses Parade? Listen to that, the parade, the Bread and Roses Strike. How did it come to be known under that particular name?
So the strike spreads. The strike lasts from January 11, January 12, until almost the end of March.
Okay.
So it lasts about 11 weeks, almost 12 weeks. Over the course of the time, again, in the run-up to the strike, workers from all the various immigrant groups in the city have created a 35-person steering committee to run the strike if in fact the strike happens.
Okay.
And they're very skilled at what they do, and they make sure there's representatives from all the different immigrant groups, all the different nationalities, all the language groups in the city. They're all on this committee.
Okay.
And they essentially collectively say all meetings, everything that's written, everything we do will be done in all the languages of all the people in the room. And so this is important because there have been other attempts at strikes like this, but they folded in a way because there was not this kind of unity created across all the different groups. This time it worked. So they would have these gigantic strike meetings where people would be, so if I understood English and also spoke Italian, I would find a group of workers who only spoke Italian if somebody was speaking in English, and I would go to them and be listening to what the person was saying in English and translating it into Italian for those groups of workers. And so this would happen all over the area. So these meetings would take a heck of a lot longer, but nonetheless, if they didn't do this, it probably would have fallen apart.
Right.
The other thing that they did, which was really great, at the beginning of the strike, the mayor of the city declared that there could be no crowds, no mobs, no rallies blocking the bridges over the canals into the mills. You can't stand still, he said.
Okay.
And groups can't stand still in the city of Lawrence, martial law. And so the workers one up them and say, okay, we can't stand still, we can walk, and we can walk slowly. And we can walk very slowly in groups of 500, 750, 1,000 workers. And while we're walking, we can also sing. And so we can sing in all the different languages of all the different people that are marching on any given day. This builds even more camaraderie.
Right. That's right.
The newspapers commented on it all the time. They say, these people are crazy. All they do is sing. What's wrong with them? They're on strike, but they sing. So some of the newspapers actually call it the singing strike because it's so obvious that this is what's happening. And so they're marching, singing, demonstrating, trying to block. So the key is to make it so that the mill owners can't bring any workers in to break the strike to go into the mills.
Right.
And so for the duration of the strike, the mills don't operate. Nobody gets in. The mills are locked down. There's no work going on.
There's no work. The people who are on strike, I'm a social worker, so these people who are on strike, what are they living on if they're not earning anything? How were they able to survive?
So the way that they get by, a couple things. There's a large group in the city of Franco-Belgium immigrants, people that come from the France-Belgium border, who have a particular skill in woolen mills and textiles, and they're actually, ironically enough, they're recruited to come to Lawrence to operate this new kind of machinery, but they bring with them one of their political traditions, which is food co-ops. And so from the time that they're in Lawrence, they're making arrangements. They're not thinking there's going to be a strike, but just to feed their families and whatever, they create this vast network with all the farms in the area. And they have a store, they have, they basically accumulate foodstuffs. And so as it gets closer to the strike, in like October, November, December, they go to all the farms and get potatoes and cabbage and root vegetables, all the kind of things that will keep, right? And they accumulate all this stuff in their food co-op. And so that's one way people get fed. So they have a strike kitchen that feeds people at least a meal a day. And then what happens is as the news of the strike spreads, people start donating money. Workers in Lowell bring several cows to be slaughtered for meat. Other workers donate money. Money is just sent through the mail to the strike with like coins in an envelope. Women at all the colleges in the area, Radcliffe, Wellesley, Mount Holyoke, Smith, they all raise money on their campuses and bring it to support the strike. It's fascinating because Harvard, the men at Harvard actually are hired to help police the strike, and they become part of the militia that tries to put the strike down. Whereas Radcliffe, Wellesley, Mount Holyoke, and Smith, their women are supporting the strike, women again. Right. And so it's really fascinating. So this has a life to it as it chugs along.
It builds. It really builds.
It builds
and
momentum.
People respect what they're seeing.
Right.
They're not seeing it as a dangerous thing.
Well, some people are.
Well, the people in power
are.
The mill owners are, the people in power. And you mentioned militia and 2 deaths. How did that happen?
So So the use of the word militia would be like National Guard today.
Okay.
So in the early 20th century, it's called the state militia. And so Mayor Scanlon calls the governor of the state and says, I need the state militia to come and restore order in my city. And so people go. The president of Harvard says to his students, anybody that wants to go and be part of this militia, you can get out of your final exams, you'll get passing grades, and you can go, and you
Okay.
can help put the strike down. And so the militia shows up, bayonets, rifles, horses, trying to chase down, ride down people in the streets. And in late January on an afternoon, there's a big sort of strike rally on the corner of Union Street and Garden Streets in Lawrence, and a young woman striker, Annie Lapizzo, is shot and dies right on the corner. And it's clear to everybody there that she's shot by either a policeman or the militia. Strikers never were found to have weapons with them, and why would a striker shoot
Yeah.
another striker?
Right, right.
Nonetheless, 3 strike leaders are arrested. They're arrested for her death, and it's a really weird, convoluted argument. The argument is they're arrested for her death as accessories before the fact, because if there wasn't a strike, she wouldn't have been dead.
Oh my gosh.
And so these 3 strike leaders are put in jail in Salem in early February of 1912, and they end up having a trial. They're ultimately found not guilty in Salem court,
Okay.
but not until after Thanksgiving of 1912. So they spend several months in jail
Unbelievable.
as accessories before the fact.
Before the fact.
We're very creative with our laws
Yes, aren't
sometimes,
we?
right?
Aren't we? Yes, I'm trying to think of the logic behind it. There's
Yeah.
a false logic thing that they
Yeah.
use there.
And
Yeah.
then another striker, a young kid, 15, 16 years old, John Ramey, is bayoneted in the back. The history is somewhat murky. Most people don't think it was intentional, but on the other hand, the militia's running with bayonets on the end of their rifles, chasing a group. It's slippery, it's snowy. This kid sort of slips, falls, and
Yeah.
what the story is from the
Yeah.
militia is he ran onto the bayonet. But nonetheless, he's bayoneted in the side. He goes home, gets in bed. His mom tries to wake him up the next day. He's bled to death, and he's passed. So Annie Lapizzo and John Ramey
Those are the two.
both end up, as casualties of the strike.
Right.
And it's thought that those deaths might sort of be the end of the strike, but in fact, people become even more anxious, even more
Sure.
angry, and the strike holds.
The strike held. It's famous.
It's famous.
It's famous
yes.
in our country. Do people, I think people around here understand that and know that. It is taught in our history books, isn't it?
It's taught somewhat. It's not. I mean, one of my contentions is it should be taught more, but obviously because I'm passionate about it, so I think it should be taught more, right? But when it is taught, even in college textbook, when it's written, it's always written up as being a very spontaneous reaction to a pay cut. And I find that, that's faulty history, because as we were just talking about a few minutes ago,
Right.
that's not the case, but it minimizes the strength of the strike, it minimizes the organization, it minimizes the ability that workers had to create the solidarity
right.
across religion, language, ethnicities, nationalities,
Right.
all the rest of it, and I think it shortchanges what the strike really represented. And so it's still taught somewhat badly. The reason it becomes famous at the time is because there are so many different nationalities. All of foreign language newspapers come. So there's British papers covering, that's not a foreign language. Well, it's kind of a foreign language, the way British speaking. But anyway, French, German, Italian,
Sure.
Greek, all these newspapers come and cover the strike, plus all the big national magazines of the day, New York Times, Boston Globe. So there's reporters there all the time. And they're more or less writing a fairly objective accounting of what
Oh, okay.
they see. And so for me as a researcher, and for other people researching the strike, you really can so I've read all the daily newspapers for the duration of the strike
right.
to get the day-to-day. And they're not bad. Sometimes the editorials, that's a whole other story depending
Right.
on the paper, but the actual day-to-day of what's going on, the contention in the street and stuff, they're pretty good at it.
that's pretty accurate. The editorials, well, whoever owns the newspaper, and that kind of
Yeah.
thing. But the actual news reporting
Yep.
was fairly accurate.
And there were also some pretty progressive magazines at the time. There's a magazine called The Outlook. Harper's is around back then. There are other magazines. There's in the United States at this period. There's a fairly lively socialist press,
Yeah.
and so there's all of that coverage as well.
Sure,
So,
sure.
because it's so different in the sense of the way it's being played out, it does get a lot of media coverage, and that's how also, back to your question of how do workers survive, this is partly the way that more funds come in, the
Right.
more the strike's known, the more people want to
Right.
donate. And the turning point, so the real turning point in the strike is that in early February, workers decide to do something that hadn't been done that we can tell yet in the United States.
Oh,
And so in European strikes, a lot of times if it's a lengthy strike, strikers will send their kids out of the city where the strike is to relatives, friends, strike supporters in other cities. So their kids can be fed, clothed, go to school wherever they are, be taken care of and be safe.
sure.
It hadn't been done in the United States, but again, because there's all these different immigrant workers in the city, this idea starts to percolate, and eventually that's what happens. And so hundreds of kids get sent to New York, Philadelphia, Boston, other cities. Barry, Vermont takes about 50 kids, mostly Italian kids. Barry has a really large Italian immigrant population. They take a whole big bunch of Italian kids. And so each time the kids go, that gets even more publicity, because
Right.
like when they go to New York, they get out of the train station and they have
Go
a
to the
march
train.
down the streets in New
Yeah.
York. We're the kids from Lawrence and whatever, and it gets even more, right? And so this makes the mayor and William Wood, the head of the corporation, crazy. And so they pass this edict: no kids can leave. Twisting and bending the law, right? No kids can leave, right, they say. And so on this particular morning in March, in the middle of March, a bunch of kids have already got their tickets, chaperones have come up from Philadelphia, and a trainload of kids is going to go to Philadelphia. So it's a Saturday morning, the moms and the kids arrive at the train
Right,
station. Tracks are surrounded by state militia. The women try to get their kids on the train, and the militia beat the heck out of the women and the kids and throw them all in jail. And so this then generates even more negative press.
Right,
So it
right.
backfires, right? The idea of stopping the kids leaving somehow seemed okay in their brain or whatever, but it also then seemed okay to physically prevent them,
Right.
a mom from putting her kid on a train with a train ticket.
Right.
And so this creates even more stir. And so what happens now, which is really fascinating, people in Congress call for hearings about the strike. What's going on? What's going on in Lawrence? And so they invite William Wood and the mill owners and some of the mill supervisors, but also strikers, strike leaders,
Good.
and some of these kids. And so the strikers and the strike leaders and the kids go to Congress and testify on the record, right? So again, another treasure that we have
That's right.
to know about the strike is we have the congressional record of these
Right.
hearings.
Right.
So these kids testify about the brutal treatment at the train station, about being 11, 12, 13 and working in the mills. One young girl testifies about having her scalp torn out, her hair caught in a machine belt and having her scalp torn out. And it turns out, for the first, again, the intricacies of it all, we think for the first time, the president's wife, William Howard Taft is the president, his wife is in the hearing room. And we think it's the first time the wife of a president ever actually went and sat in on a congressional hearing.
Okay.
So she's there. When the testimony ends for the day, she invites the kids to go to the White House. And so they meet Taft. And Taft is this huge guy. He weighs over 400 pounds.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
And one of the kids says to him, "You're pretty big." Just like that, right? Mrs. Taft writes a $5,000 check to support the strike.
Wow.
We think what happened, but we don't have any evidence of it, sadly, is that Mrs. Taft told Mr. Taft, "Fix it. I just heard stuff that's outrageous. You fix it." What we think happened, again, we can't prove it, is that the president called William Wood. The woolen mills in Lawrence benefited from a protective tariff that kept foreign wool expensive if it was imported into the
Okay.
country. We think what happened is Taft told Wood to figure out a way to end the strike or he might lose his tariff.
Okay.
And so
That
Wood
sounds
did
likely, though. It does sound likely.
yeah, and so Wood, we think, did the math and realized
Yeah.
giving the strikers raises
Yeah.
and meeting some of their other
Yeah.
demands made way more sense
Right,
than over
right.
the long run losing
Right.
this protective tariff
Okay.
for their wool. And so within just a few days after the hearings and everything, there's a big strike meeting on the Lawrence Common and it's settled and
Okay.
workers win their demands.
All right. So this basically, I know there were 2 deaths, I know there's a militia, but basically this was a successful strike. And it was the first successful strike in our country,
I
would you
wouldn't
say?
I wouldn't, no, I wouldn't say it's
No.
the first successful
Okay,
strike in the country.
okay.
I would say it's the first glimpse into the possibility of organizing unskilled, semi-skilled
Okay.
women and immigrant workers.
Okay.
I mean, there had been strikes that succeeded,
Sure.
but they were usually much more narrow.
Right.
I mean, there had been strikes of railroad
Sure.
workers, there had been coal mines. I
Right.
mean, there had been other
Yeah.
things, but
Yeah.
I mean, this was on a grand scale. This was in effect the entire, I mean, the city of Lawrence produced more wool than any other city in America. I
Okay,
mean,
I
it
didn't know
was
that.
produced like over 40% of the
Okay.
wool in the
Alright.
country. I mean, it was a major economic
Right.
engine. And it was shut down tight for 3 months by a majority of women workers,
Mm-hmm.
unskilled workers, immigrant workers.
Right. Basically, we're going to be winding down soon. We could talk for hours about
I
this.
told you we could.
I know you did. You did tell me that. What's impressive to me is the history of it in this particular area, and that we have someone like you who really gets into it and studies it, and you even have questions about how it's being taught. I think that's important too. You
Yeah,
know,
I
how
mean,
it's being taught.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a teacher, and so
Yeah,
I really
right.
think a lot about how I do what I do, right? I mean,
Right.
what's really interesting too, it could be a whole other show, is that in Lawrence, after the strike, the history and the memory of the strike is actually suppressed. So on the 50th anniversary of the strike, they don't celebrate the strike. So in October of 1912, the priests and other religious people and the mayor and the police in Lawrence organized something called the God and Country Parade
Okay.
to try to create this image that we're not like those crazy workers.
When was that?
1962.
I remember that.
Yeah, it was a big deal.
I remember that.
It was a big deal.
Yes. Okay.
And so it was the 50th,
Okay.
it was
All right.
the 50th anniversary
right.
of the strike, but rather than celebrate the strike, and so the history really went
Right.
underground for a long time.
Okay. But then comes the 100th anniversary,
Yeah, well, we did it up.
and you did it up big. And now we have this Labor Day weekend. There's going to be the yearly celebration.
Bread and Roses Festival
The
on
Bread and
Lawrence
Roses
Common, the
Festival.
exact place where the strike meetings occurred.
Okay.
There are
And
walking tours of the
Good.
sites of the strike,
yeah.
trolley tours of the sites of the strike if you don't want to walk.
Okay.
But there's a lot. We put, people worked hard in the centennial year to put a monument to the strikers on the Lawrence Common. There's a
Yes.
beautiful monument
Yes. Good.
that,
Good.
that people can come and see. And so, yeah, we've tried to do the best we can to
You've done good.
resurrect the real history.
It's part of our history, cannot get away from it. And I want to thank you so much for coming, and we could be talking for hours. And I want to thank you for watching, and maybe I'm going to be going to the festival this year. Maybe I'll see some of you there.
And I'll guide you on a walking tour.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Oh my gosh.
For the Young at Heart is sponsored by Duville Life and Wellness Community, a commitment to care, a legacy of compassion. This is Duville.